Hello, today I'd like to show you how you can make a simple block using some 5-inch squares as your starting point. So this is just two strips sewn together that started out coming from 5-inch squares. I have done a pattern using this block, which is available on my website as a downloadable pattern on GourmetQuilter.com, and it's called Strips Using 5-inch Squares. So the way I have achieved this is that I've started out with some 5-inch squares, and I have chosen today to use some blues and greens primarily, just an assortment of different fabrics that are in 5-inch square format. But initially I'm going to have to trim those squares down just a little bit. The block will end up being a 4.5-inch block measured, 4-inch finished. So initially we just need to trim off 1/2 inch down one side of your 5-inch squares. Now I've got a little stack of squares here so that I can cut several together, and so I'm lining it up with my board, and I'm going to trim away 1/2 inch from just one side of those squares. So now it's not square anymore, and this bit will be wasted. Now I'm going to turn that round so that I can line it up nice and straight again, and then I'm going to cut those in half, so they'll measure 2.5 inches from the edge because it started off at 5 inches, and I'm going to cut that. Now that wasn't so hard. So there I've got a couple of little piles of 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch strips now, and I'm going to show you now how I sew them together using chain piecing to be able to make the blocks. So now I've got my piles of strips ready to sew, and so I'm going to swap them around a little bit. So I won't be sewing this pile to this pile because they're going to be the same fabrics. So I would swap my piles around so that as I pick up two fabrics, they're going to be different fabrics and go together. So I'll pick up two fabrics, put them right sides together, and then I've got a 1/4 inch foot on my machine, and I'm going to just sew my 1/4 inch seam. And instead of taking it out and using all that thread that you use up as you pull fabric away from the machine, I'm just going to keep sewing. This is what they call chain piecing. So you can see there's just a couple of stitches between each piece, and I can continue on chain piecing until I've got all my pieces together. So this is a fairly quick method. It is quite important that you get your 1/4 inch seam allowance right. And as I said, I'm just picking up the fabrics, so they're going together randomly. Some will be similar, some will have more contrast. So you can see my chain is growing. So now I've made a pile of my blocks, and I've taken them to the iron, and I've pressed the seam in one direction. If you have a choice between light and dark, it's always a good idea to press the seam towards the darker fabric. In this case my fabrics are fairly similar, so it hasn't mattered too much. So now I have got a block that is going to measure 4.5 inches, and so I've made a pile of those, and to put it together in the order that I have for my quilt, I would lay them all out, and all I have to do is alternate the direction of the blocks. So one going one way and one going the other way, and make my rows. And it's quite a good idea when you're using a whole variety of different fabrics to lay perhaps the whole quilt out, just so that you get a balance of colour, because you may end up with all the dark ones in one corner or something like that. But generally speaking, it's going to be fairly random. And then I would just join my rows together, as I've done here. And when I press the seams on this one, as you can see, the seams are going one way on the block, but where I've joined the blocks together, I have pressed the seams away from where that seam is, so that they're always going into a flat strip. This will fairly naturally fall that way, and then when you go to sew one row to the next row, you'll find that the seams will butt together at those points where they cross over, which will make it easier for piecing the rows together. So you start off making your blocks, put them together into rows like this, and then join your rows together, and then you can add your borders and quilt it and bind it as you'd like to do. So thank you. I was just happy to show you another way of using some 5-inch squares. So here I've made a sample of the quilt in completely different colours, just so that you can get an idea of how it can look made up differently.